Welcome, everybody. I'm Chris Whatley. I'm the Washington Director for the Council of State Governments, and I want to thank everybody for taking time on their Wednesday afternoon to talk through kind of what's going to happen in the next Congress, or the Congress that we have going right now, and how it might affect state budgets. And I'm delighted to be joined by two of my great colleagues from other state associations here in the Hall of States building, Matt Salo, who's the Executive Director of the National Association of Medicaid Directors, and Catherine White, who's with the National Association of State Budget Officers. And basically what we want to do is anybody who has paid any attention to the news, anyone other than someone who just came out of a medically induced coma, realizes that in the wee hours of this new year, Congress passed a tax compromise that was read by few, loved by none, but will affect all of us. And in fact, it set in place a lot of new deadlines for new cliff-like possibilities that are going to echo out in state budgets for years to come. In fact, I would say that probably the best analysis on this in terms of just the public zeitgeist around this comes from Stephen Colbert, who on Monday, he said that over the holidays he paid no attention to the news at all, but he knows that the economic cataclysm was averted simply by the fact that he didn't spend the week fighting seagulls for discarded hot dog buns. Well, that's probably what the public thinks right now, but ultimately we've got to process all of this and figure out what it means in terms of revenue forecasting, what it means in terms of managing the major state federal programs that kind of dictate the parameters of the state budget, Medicaid being the first and foremost of those. And to do that, what we're going to do is we're going to give a little bit of brief background on the front end, which I'll do, and then I'm going to turn it over to my expert panelists here who know far more about this than I do. And then we welcome your questions. Everybody's on listen mode. If you have a question, just enter it into the question box right there on the webinar toolbar, and we look forward to hearing from all of you. But in terms of where we are, it helps to just take one brief look at that cliff, the kind of economic meteor that was heading towards the United States and that was partially averted. The base of it was the expiring tax rates. You had the sequestration cuts in the middle and the doc fix on the top. So altogether, it depends on how you choose to score it, whether you just look at the fiscal year or whether you look across the calendar year. I like the calendar year calculus, so about $700 billion that was scheduled to be stripped out of the American economy and tip us into recession. We've largely averted it, but we haven't completely averted it. We still have about $250 billion worth of spending that's going to be sapped out of the economy as a result of, most importantly, the expired payroll tax cuts. Then the increases on high earners that were part of sealing the compromise, and then the sequestration cuts, which have been reduced a bit because 2 months of them were removed from by the compromise itself, but they're still there. And according to Mark Zandi, that will take maybe half a percentage point out of the economic growth rate for next year. So we're not tipped into recession, but there certainly has been an economic impact by the cliff that remains. And really, when we were looking at the cliff as states, it was the impact on the real economy that mattered more in terms of state budget planning than any cuts in programs and expenditure that were tied to some of those expiring programs. Now, what does the deal mean specifically? It's basically the status quo. We didn't have a big bang tax reform compromise that was, cobbled together in the last few hours of 2012. That's probably a good thing, because any effort to do major tax reform would have put state tax deductions in play, and it would have been done in a quick way in which states would have had limited input. So tax treatment for states largely untouched. There are a few changes that we can discuss later. No changes in entitlement programs. So Medicaid itself, spared again, kind of like in the budget or the Budget Control Act of 2011. Sequestration put off by 2 months and reduced by putting it off for 2 months. So basically the 28 out of 42 major lanes of the state-federal funding relationship, the 42 major state federal grant programs that states receive, the cuts to those 28 programs are going to be 6% instead of 8% for the fiscal year. So largely either good news or status quo. And at the same time, the reductions in tax credits and deduction levels will mean some small increases in tax revenue for states who use federal adjusted gross income levels. Certainly there are some states who allow you to deduct your federal taxes. They're going to have a net revenue loss, not a huge one, but a minor one. But for most states, by changing these credit and deduction levels, there's going to be a little bit more tax revenue flowing in. So status quo or slightly better in some ways. But there were some opportunities missed in this, in that if we were to go back 1 month, I would say that the state community in general, the National Governors Association, CSG, all of the different state groups, and the locals as well, were pretty optimistic that any vehicle out of the last Congress was going to have the Marketplace Fairness Act attached to it, which would have allowed states to compel online sellers to collect the sales taxes that are already due to states. But in the drama around the cliff averting compromise, basically it was pushed off into the new Congress, and in some ways is now attached to a possible tax reform debate. So basically we lost that opportunity to get it passed in the old Congress, and had it gone through, states would have been able to collect upwards of $20 billion a year, and there are more specific estimates that all your states have. So that's one of the lost opportunities in that last minute debate. But there's also one more that's a bit more quixotic. It's kind of inelegantly named the credit for state death taxes, which in addition to being perhaps one of the worst conglomerations of English vocabulary in the history of the language, once upon a time delivered over $7 billion to state coffers every year, really up until 2001. This was a special kind of a state tax that states put in place over the course of the 20th century that would enable them to levy estate taxes on their population, but have it tied specifically to a federal credit for state estate taxes paid, so that a state could have an estate tax, collect the revenue, but individual taxpayers would see no net benefit or net impact. Their pockets wouldn't be picked by the state because they would get full credit from the feds for every dollar they paid to the state. Well, that went away in the Bush 2001 tax cuts, and it was one of those things that everybody was tracking in some oblique way to see if the full 2001 tax code would have gone back into place at the expiration of those tax cuts on January 1st. Well, in that compromise at the very last minute, Congress managed to put in a permanent repeal of the credit for state death taxes. So basically, it's kind of off the table, and there were a few states who were anticipating that their dormant estate tax laws could have come back in effect and given them some revenue. And it's not a small amount of revenue, because had the CSTD gone back into effect on January 1st, states would have gotten $3 billion more this year. So those are a few of the opportunities missed. But beyond that, we got to start thinking about what do we plan for next. On the one hand, we can just look at that debate that led up to the Cliff Compromise, and one thing that was absent from it was a huge, loud, and resounding voice from anyone for massive changes to the non-defense side of sequestration. In fact, if you were to poll, your mother-in-law or someone that you met on the street, and someone who pays attention to the news a lot, someone who's trying to stay informed, and ask them what sequestration means, they would just talk about defense cuts. That's what the public debate was. No one was screaming about the changes to Title I education and LIHEAP, and not no one. Certainly there are interest groups who are very mobilized around those areas, but their voice never became part of the major public debate. And as a result, I think that you have to assume that the cut levels that were planned for those programs in the full sequestration would probably be retained in any kind of New Deal to avert a debt ceiling vote, and they could be even increased. In fact, the Budget Control Act of 2011, which set in place its own series of cuts, has some flexibility where the cuts within it could be reapportioned between defense and non-defense in FY14 and years beyond. So I personally think that we're going to see more cuts to the discretionary spending side that states depend on for things like special education and low-income impacted schools, energy programs, a lot of these different elements of the state-federal fiscal relationship. The other side is that although the increase in tax rates and the kind of hand-wringing that's happened as a result of that has dampened some interest in tax reform. You know, that it's going to be harder to do a big bang approach towards tax reform than if there had been a compromise that had set a marker for Congress that they had to come up with another $800 billion in revenue by limiting deductions. Something like that would have propelled the tax reform discussion. We didn't get that. We got a deal that raised rates, and you've got a lot of members of Congress that had to hold their nose to vote on that. And it makes it harder to embark on this major tax reform effort, but it still exists as a policy ask across a broad spectrum of Congress, particularly because our corporate rates as a nation, at least the objective corporate tax rate, is the highest among the industrialized world. You know, our effective rate, what we actually collect after we give people special dispensation and deductions, is a lot lower than that. But there's a real effort to try to limit deductions, to perhaps make corporate rates more economically competitive, and perhaps do some other things in the tax code to incentivize economic growth. But if you do that, that puts state tax deductions squarely in the crosshairs again. And as a reminder, if you just look at the slide before you, and the $750 billion or so of tax expenditure, you know, in these categories of the top 10 tax deductions, the one that is just stands out more than anything else as politically feasible to go after are the provisions that benefit states. The $70 billion or so that you get from state and local income and sales tax deductions, and the exclusion of interest on public purpose state and local bonds, which are about $36 billion. Everything else there has a mobilized, energized constituency with a clear political voice. The state elements of this, not the case. So any major tax reform debate is going to put those tax measures that states depend on, or at least state taxpayers benefit from in states that levy these kind of taxes, or states that utilize bonds like every state does to fund infrastructure. All of those measures are going to be in the crosshairs. And that leads us to the final slide and kind of where we lead. We've got 60 to 90 days of crazy deadlines. First, we've got the debt ceiling vote, which if you look at the news today, there's some measures that show that we could hit the debt ceiling around February 15th. Going into the new year, we were thinking more the end of February, but whether it's February 15th or whether it's February 28th, it doesn't matter. It's coming up fast. So Congress is going to have to act. That's the first thing out of the box. You've similarly got the sequestration deadline that was put off by 2 months, but it still comes into place at the beginning of March. So ideally, you would have a vote that would tie in those two deadlines. And then the continuing resolution that's funding the federal government itself expires on March 27th. So a lot of big deadlines coming up. And we've got limited options. The Budget Control Act kind of expired the amount of depth that we have as a nation to deal with the deficit problem through discretionary spending. And in fact, you're getting pushback on the defense side of discretionary spending, saying how can we shave off some of those cuts. So you're not going to reach the next big compromise through discretionary spending. And as we saw from the hand-wringing over the tax compromise, the ability to do anything on the revenue side is extremely limited. So what does that leave? That leaves entitlement spending and Medicaid in particular. And with that, what I want to do is turn it over to the expert that we have before us, who has the best sense of what might be coming for Medicaid as that lodestar of the state-federal fiscal relationship, and what he sees in terms of the options before us and the scenarios that keep you up at night. So Matt, over to you.
Okay, thanks Chris, and thanks for having me on this afternoon. So what I'll do is talk, well, primarily about Medicaid, because that's what we do, that's what I know, and I'm really going to avoid any sense of, or any discussion of macroeconomics or tax policy or any of the other stuff. Just talk about what Congress is going to do, or what they may do, and how it will impact Medicaid. And I'll try to do this in about 10 minutes or so. So if I run over, give me the hook, because I want to make sure we leave time for Q&A at the end. And so I think it's important to start off by talking about sort of the starting point, the baseline. You talked about sequestration a lot, and it's important to keep in mind that should Congress fail to come up with any kind of grand bargain or any kind of sustainable big fix, we go into sequestration. and that does bring with it some defense and some non-defense cuts. And a number of people have sort of said, well, that might not be all that bad because sequestration, by the rules of the game, exempts Medicaid from the cuts. And so from Medicaid's perspective, might not that be an okay scenario? I would caution people against that, because while it's true that sequestration would exempt Medicaid from direct hits, sequestration would, in effect, take a pretty sizable chunk out of almost all of the rest of domestic discretionary spending. You know, whether it's HIV/AIDS spending, whether it's public health, whether it's Ryan White's, you know, whatever is going on in state healthcare spending, that would get hit. And if you know Medicaid, you know that Medicaid does not exist in a vacuum, and that it has very strong correlations and connections with all of those programs. So to the extent that any of those programs, funding for Native American clinics, whatever, if those get hit, what you often see is Medicaid being forced to step up and fill in the gaps. So keep that in mind. Even as sequestration happens, Medicaid might not be truly exempt. So the next thing I want to touch on real briefly is the temporary deal that they did enact at the, well, wasn't really the last minute, it was sort of after the last minute, and bought us another couple of months. There were a couple of Medicaid-related provisions, but by and large, Medicaid was not a big component of the temporary deal. The temporary deal did formally eliminate part of the Affordable Care Act known as the Class Act. That was sort of an attempt, an ill-fated attempt to try to create a non-Medicaid oriented long-term care program. This was really doomed from day one. It was very, very poorly designed and never really got off the ground, and it was sort of DOA from the get-go. So they formally got rid of it, although that was kind of a done deal. But what they did is they sort of created a, well, in effect, a non-binding long-term care commission that Congress will create to look at some of the issues and try to come up with some solutions, which I argue better than nothing, but it's non-binding, so don't get your hopes too much up. But there's also a provision in the temporary deal that does affect disproportionate share hospital funding. And but at least in terms of the way that I see it, it's not really so much of a cut, although one could look at it that way. And to understand what they did, it's important, again, to go back and look at the Affordable Care Act. And there's a funny provision. So the Affordable Care Act did a number of things, one of which, the big thing, expanded coverage very, very broadly, through Medicaid, through the exchanges, et cetera. And as part of that, in conjunction with that, because coverage was being expanded, they wanted to also reduce what we were spending on uncompensated care for hospitals. Makes perfect sense. But the funny thing about the ACA is that while the coverage expansions, the Medicaid expansion, the exchanges, were sort of designed to be permanent, the disproportionate share hospital, the DSH cuts, actually expired after 10 years. And so after that 10-year period, the DSH payments would have reverted to pre-ACA levels with no real policy rationale for doing that. So in essence, what Congress has sort of created is, kind of it's a well that they can go to anytime they need money. So since there's no policy rationale for those DSH payments to go back to the pre-ACA levels, all Congress has to do is extend those DSH levels another year, and by the magic of Congressional Budget Office scoring, they get X number of billions of dollars, which is funny money, it's free money, but in essence it's no different on the reverse from things like, well, hey, the Bush tax cuts expire, you have to go find money to extend them. This is the same thing, just in reverse. You extend these and you create money. So that's what it did. It's not anything too alarming. But that leaves the big question of what's going to happen to Medicaid in the grand bargain that let's assume they come up with, because I think the political expediency to do it is still pretty strong. And it's the great unknown. We don't know. We don't know what the size of the bargain will be. We don't know what the balance between tax revenue and entitlement reforms will be. We don't know within the entitlement world the relative weight of Medicaid versus Medicare versus Social Security changes will be. $10 billion, 25, 100, 0, we don't know. And that creates a whole lot of confusion, uncertainty, and difficulty planning, as anybody in the States clearly knows. We kind of have a sense of if they were going to go after Medicaid for X amount of dollars, there's a fairly limited number of ways that they can get that kind of money. And the challenge is that most of those have pretty serious ramifications for how the program is financed. So, and we can pretty much count them on one hand. If you're going to get any kind of significant federal savings in Medicaid, the avenues are either capping the federal commitment, and you usually do that through some sort of block grant or a per capita cap. Now, I would argue that with Obama reelected and a stronger Democratic majority in the Senate, the odds of that happening diminish significantly, since that tends to be sort of a Republican public policy goal. But it's still out there in terms of possibilities. Another thing you could do is minimize the federal contribution. So you could, rather than capping it, just reduce every state's federal match. If you're a 50-50 state now, maybe the federal match goes down to 49 or whatever. I put that out there because actually the president proposed that originally about a year and a half ago as part of his contribution to the budget deficit discussions. The important thing now, the development on that, has been that in recent guidance, the administration has formally, officially backed off of that proposal. So I think we can effectively say that's not likely to happen. And then really the only other things that could be potentially on the table would be to take a look at things like provider taxes, which tend to be looked at least on the Hill, from a bipartisan perspective as being, pretty much akin to waste, fraud, and abuse, or, the old quote-unquote states gaming the system. That's always going to be a popular approach, although, when you actually try to implement it and you realize how much of any given state's financing is nursing home taxes, hospital bed taxes, insurance company taxes, physician taxes, when you realize how intertwined that is with how the program works, it becomes very, very difficult to actually do that. But in related to that, you'll see folks. In fact, we saw Senator Hatch sort of putting out some statements relatively recently, looking at DISH money and sort of DISH-related funding, and sort of wondering, isn't this kind of, can't we just get rid of some of this? It's not really all that. We don't really like it all that much. Now, while there's a whole lot of unknown here, and I'll wrap up in just a second here, I think the one thing that is important to note is that these deficit reduction talks and Medicaid's role, they're no longer being done in just the context of this sort of hypothetical, theoretical entitlement reform. They're being done in the 2013 calendar in the context of states, governors, and state legislatures making a decision whether or not to take up the Medicaid expansion option that was, part of ACA, but then obviously influenced by the Supreme Court. And it has become very, very clear that the President and the administration are acutely aware that any effort to significantly reduce federal funding in Medicaid, to do any kind of cost shift, will have an immediate and direct impact on governors and states who are making that decision. And that anything, and that's why they backed off that reduced FMAP. They know that, you know, if they go forward with a significant Medicaid hit, they're likely to see some number, 2, 5, 10, 15, we don't know, states say, oh, wait a minute, we can't trust you, the federal government, to keep your commitments on this Medicaid expansion financing. No thanks. So I think the administration will actually try a lot harder than they would have to keep Medicaid off the table as much as possible. Now the question is, can they keep it completely off the table? I don't know. And then just the final thing to keep in mind is that, again, because Medicaid doesn't operate in a vacuum, it doesn't do it with domestic discretionary, it also doesn't operate in a vacuum with respect to Medicare. Mm-hmm. So to the extent that Congress goes after Medicare, cracking down on home health payments, for example, as they've done in the past, raising the age of eligibility, as they have certainly proposed, any of those could potentially have a direct, immediate cost shift to Medicaid as well. Mm-hmm. So, and it's less obvious for Congress when they think about those things. So keep all of those things in mind. It's hard to run a program with all of its complexities in this kind of under this cloud of uncertainty, but this is our lot, and you know, we're certainly here to try to help figure out what's happening and what's going to happen. But I'll stop there. And
well, thanks, Matt. And we've got questions coming in. Please keep sending your questions. I'm going to turn it over to Catherine, because NASBO really deals with all angles of this. You know, you deal with the Medicaid dimension because it's so much an impact on general fund spending of the states. But you deal with the revenue streams and everything else that states do on the revenue side and on the expenditure side. So, Catherine, maybe you could just give me your reaction to the cliff compromise that was reached and this next series of deadlines and debates that are going to trip off over the next 60 days or so, and get your perspective and your members' concerns on what this means for them.
Sure. Well, thank you, Chris, and thank you, Matt, too, for that really good overview of sort of what states need to be looking out for in the next round of cliff discussions. As Matt was saying, this cloud of uncertainty around what federal lawmakers will do to reduce the deficit, and especially with these big deadlines looming that Chris mentioned. This cloud of uncertainty is really what we've been hearing from our members about most consistently and most regularly. It makes it very difficult for state budget offices to plan when there is such unpredictability around federal spending and tax policies. You know, before the fiscal cliff deal was reached, of course, as Chris mentioned, the economic impacts of potentially going over the cliff, namely fears of recession, were a huge concern in the states, and also just more generally forecasting revenues with state tax codes usually linked to the federal tax code in a number of ways was very difficult in planning budgets, and fall is a big time for budget, very busy time for budget offices in planning their budgets, and of course cuts to federal funding for states under sequestration was also another cause for uncertainty. By the time the fiscal cliff deal was reached, to deal with these questions, at least temporarily, a number of governors had already had to release their budgets. And so what we were hearing before the deal was reached from states was that they, for the most part, had to just assume that the fiscal cliff scenario was, that at least the major near-term components of it were averted somehow. But that can be very unsettling, and but that's what you have to do in that type of uncertainty. A number of states did, though, attempt to run some alternative scenarios, for example, looking at what would happen potentially to state revenue if the fiscal cliff had not been avoided and the economy had entered recession. And some state offices have been required to develop contingency plans that account for sequestration to be delivered to their legislatures if that turns out to be necessary. So now that the fiscal cliff bill has been passed, some of the big immediate questions have been answered. Fears of recession have calmed, and uncertainty around tax revenue collections have largely been addressed, and that has been helpful on the revenue side in planning for the next fiscal year and beyond. But there's still, of course, the question left about sequestration, which is now scheduled to be triggered on March 1st rather than January 2nd, unless Congress acts to prevent it. State fiscal conditions continue to improve gradually, but resources are still constrained, and so states have indicated that they just don't have the funds available to make up for these federal cuts in the event that sequestration takes place. And while the amount of the sequester has been reduced by the deal, it should be noted, of course, that if the cuts do get triggered, that they will need to be implemented over a shorter period of time, 7 months as opposed to 9 months remaining in the federal fiscal year. And in terms of contingency planning, we know that some states have identified some reserves to help partially offset the loss of federal funds. Some have been working with their agency staff to determine what grants that are covered by the sequester, how that will affect their programs' budgets, and of course, whether or not they will be able to potentially receive some replacement funds from states. But overall, sequestration, while not a large percentage of the federal funding to states, especially since Medicaid is exempt from sequestration, is still significant enough to create some real uncertainty for state budgets. And education, for example, would be hit especially hard. And then there are those states dependent on the defense industry in particular who are concerned about the impacts on their economies. So all of this uncertainty then is added to the uncertainty around what a grand bargain is going to look like, as Matt was talking about, in terms of long-term deficit reduction. That will be a major part of the negotiations in Congress as we face needing to raise the debt ceiling, deciding what to do about the sequester, and dealing with the expiring continuing resolution. And like Chris said, prospects for comprehensive tax reform have dimmed somewhat with the passage of the fiscal cliff bill, but there is still a very real possibility that Congress will try to limit tax deductions credits to achieve some savings. And for example, there's been a lot of talk about the proposal to cap the value of deductions and exemptions at 28% for high-income earners. And depending on how that's done, that could affect the value of the exemption of municipal bond interest, the deductibility of state and local taxes, those expenditures you were talking about that really do benefit state finances. There's the possibility that the Marketplace Fairness Act, as you mentioned, will be used by Congress as sort of a bargaining chip to get concessions from states on other items when looking at how to reduce the federal deficit. And then if sequestration is prevented in part or fully, there's the question of what will those cuts, of course, be replaced with. And Matt talked about the concerns around Medicaid, which have been exempt, which has been exempt from the sequester, but other exempt programs could be vulnerable too, such as SNAP, the food stamp program, and we could also, as you said, Chris, before, see more cuts to non-defense discretionary programs with concern on the Hill about the defense, avoiding the defense cuts. So, we'll be keeping a close eye on negotiations at the federal level to see how all this plays out. But the bottom line is, with so much uncertainty around federal action, it's been very difficult for states to plan their fiscal year budgets.
Certainly. Well, thank you both. Well, we've got a couple of questions that have come in, and the first is just, what about the dual eligibles, which I assume is not a reference to NCAA player eligibility rules, but perhaps has something to do with the aspects of coordinating care between Medicare and Medicaid for nursing home patients. Matt, maybe you can address that.
Sure. Well, I wish it were a discussion about the NCAA eligibility, but in terms of whether or not Congress puts sort of mandatory savings targets on the dual eligibles, I would say the prospects of that are pretty dim. If you recall, a number of months back, both the RGA, the Republican Governors Association, and the DGA, Democratic Governors Association, put out some Medicaid reforms on the table as possibly part of a deficit reduction proposal. And a big component of the DGA proposal was, based on some of the research of Ken Thorpe and others, is putting some mandatory spending figures or spending targets on some of these dual eligible demos that are currently underway at HHS. My sense is that the actual experience that we've had, so the ACA has been law since 2009, and states have certainly had interest in doing dual eligible projects for decades. Since 2009, we now have 3 states who have a memorandum of understanding with HHS for their plans to move forward with implementing a dual eligible integration demo. And I don't think any of them are going to even target it to go forward before, say, July 1 of this year, and a number more in 2014. My sense is that the progress and the politics around this issue are dicey enough that putting mandatory spending reductions or savings targets are going to be a non-starter. The politics of this continue to confound the states who, quite frankly, have been trying to improve the care of this population for no other reason than to improve their care for many years. But the politics around savings are, quite frankly, astounding. And the resistance that comes up within the Beltway amongst certain beneficiary groups, amongst certain sort of diehard Medicare bureaucracy defenders and others, that, when they start to think about savings, they go ballistic, because they interpret that as meaning that what states are doing is sacrificing people at the altar of cost savings. And that's under the current construct. And that concern, while I don't think it's real in any kind of pragmatic sense, it is real in a political sense, and it has the power to stop, and it has stopped some states from actually moving forward at all. We've had states withdraw from their efforts to do these demos because of that nonsense. So if you were to add a congressionally mandated savings target on top of that, I think it would
go from 3 states to 50 states overnight.
Yeah, the resistance would become nuclear, and the whole thing would go under. So I think for that reason alone, I think it's highly unlikely to see any kind of dual eligible savings target as part of this.
Very interesting. Now, Catherine, on your side, we had a question about what happens to state employees whose salaries are paid out of federal funds, and I think you touched upon that a bit, but maybe you could elaborate on that.
Yeah, well, I know that of course is a concern that we have heard from some of our members, and there's still a lack of clarity around what sort of flexibility states will have in making the necessary adjustments and responding to cuts in federal funding. And unfortunately, until if and when sequestration is triggered, the guidance that has been coming from OMB and other federal agencies has been lacking, and in part because they also are dealing with uncertainty around what's going to happen. So it's been difficult for state budget offices, I know, to determine what sort of flexibility they will be given within the confines of certain grant requirements. Will they be waived to enable them to realign, the percentage of funds that go towards administrative expenses versus directly to beneficiaries. So.
I was interested when you mentioned that there are at least a few states maybe who are trying to set aside some state general fund revenue to perhaps backfill a bit, and if there's at least a short-term loss of those federal grant streams. Would you view that as a very small minority of states, or is this a growing trend because state revenues are at least coming back a little bit, and maybe a year ago no states would be able to do that, but is this something that you see as being significant?
I think our examples are anecdotal,
okay.
So I can't speak to the percentage of states that have been doing that, but I know especially states that those reserves would not necessarily just be used to backfill federal funding reductions, but also those states that were particularly concerned about the potential economic and indirect effects.
Exactly.
Those states that rely heavily on defense spending, so more of a
preparing for the real cliff as opposed to just the grant streams. Okay.
Yeah. So, but there are those that are viewing reserves as a potential way to fill some of the most critical needs of the
Very interesting. Well, we have a couple of questions on provider taxes, and I think you've already given some very insightful kind of background to their state of play, Matt, in that it certainly is one of those items that is listed as a possible cut to Medicaid, that as you listed. You've mentioned that certainly because of the optics around Medicaid expansion, that touching Medicaid at all can't be done in a vacuum, that the administration is going to be putting proposals out there within the context of this broader political debate of getting states to expand Medicaid. But if blended rate and reducing FMAP is off the table, as the administration has seemed to indicate very directly to governors, and if dual eligibles is kind of unworkable because of the advocacy community on the other side of it, you're not left with much. What would you say the likelihood of provider tax cuts would be, and if so, what can states do to react to that?
Yeah, I mean, I think the challenge is that because there are so few actual avenues to get to a sizable number, and again, we don't know what the number is. Is it 100 billion? Is it 50? Is it 25? We don't know. But to put it in perspective, the last time that Congress came together to find mandatory federal savings in Medicaid was part of the Deficit Reduction Act of 2005. And their target there was $10 billion in federal Medicaid savings, and it was a hell of a lot harder than anybody thought.
Was that $10 billion over 10 years, or?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
And
yeah.
now we're thinking maybe 100 billion, maybe 50 billion.
Unlikely to be 100, but it's probably it's probably going to be larger than 10. So to get there, like I said, your options are really few. So you take, an FMAP reduction off the table. You take dual eligibles off the table. You take block grants off the table. You really got provider taxes. You've got other types of things that look to the outside perspective as squishy, like DISH and those types of payments. Of course, there's always sort of the generic fallback of, oh, isn't there just a lot of waste, fraud, and abuse, and why don't you just try harder to get rid of that? People sort of go back to the old IOM studies that say, oh, well, there's, 10%, 20%, 30% of healthcare spending that's, that serves no real purpose or what have you. And they say, well, we'll just cut you by 30% and then you go find the efficiency. Again, that all sounds great, at a 50,000-foot level, but you can't actually do it. The real world doesn't work that way. So, I think the challenge is you really get down to a point where unless you're coming up with 50 or 60 or 75 different tiny sort of sliver rifle shot approaches that add up to a number, you're either left with doing something big around provider taxes, that's going to be painful, or you're going to end up with zero. And I can make the argument that you keep the Medicaid number at zero, because quite frankly, the challenges that Medicaid has, when you look at entitlement spending, you look at Medicaid, you look at Medicare, you look at Social Security, or just look at the healthcare spending, the things that are driving healthcare entitlement spending out of control, many of those things are currently being addressed right now at the state level. In states like Arizona and Arkansas and Tennessee and Oregon and so many more than I can name, they're going after the inefficiency. They're going after the fraud, the waste, the abuse. They're going after the dysfunctional delivery systems and payment incentives. So, I can make an argument that you should actually try to support what those states are doing rather than try to, lob a depth charge across the bow in the midst of them trying to do this. How well does that play out politically? I don't know. If they need to get a number, they're going to get a number, and I'm betting it would probably be in provider taxes.
Well,
unfortunately.
And you make a very interesting point, which is just that states are already exploring those every cost savings mechanism in Medicaid that they can find. They've been pursuing for the past 5 years just because they've been staring down the barrel of this, $400 billion budget hole that they've been looking at. So, a state like New York, which has gone through a major Medicaid savings initiative, and you can either praise it or criticize it depending on how you want to look at how they chose to go after Medicaid costs, but it is a huge number. And quite frankly, the billions in Medicaid savings that New York has achieved in years going forward, just for the state's benefit, have done more to drive down federal entitlement spending than anything that Congress has accomplished in the last 2 years. So, that's just one state.
Or in the last 30 years. And I think, and again, this gets back to the challenge that this process, this deficit reduction, entitlement reform, sequestration process, is driven by Congressional Budget Office and federal budget rules. And what every single thing that a state does, everything that New York has done to bring down cost, everything that, I was just out in Arizona for a couple of days in an intensive workshop with their Medicaid agency. Their per member per month costs today for practically every population are either the exact same or even less than they were in 2006.
Wow.
Because of the aggressive efforts that they've made around care management and care coordination. Do they get any credit for that? Even though every dollar that Arizona saves is $1 or $2 the Fed save? No, they don't get any credit for this.
It's just not
and
CBO accountable.
That's not how CBO works.
Exactly.
And that I think is the real tragedy of the comments here, is that everything that we're doing isn't getting recognized.
And if we could get beyond the CBO scoring universe and just get to what policy reform drives down federal spending, then to kind of incentivize all of that state policy leadership would be one of the best courses to pursue.
Mm-hmm. But how would CBO score that? They wouldn't know how to do that.
That would require real legislation that wouldn't be scorable but would achieve results. Right. Exactly. All right. On the one of the questions on the tax side that we got is, it's kind of tough to look into the crystal ball and see a year from now and figure out how all these federal tax changes affect tax revenue on the state level. But if you were to just speculate, Catherine, would you say there are any states that have been winners or losers based on the federal tax changes that just went into effect?
Well, I know that certainly if the tax rates were not extended for the majority of Americans as they were, that would have certainly hit high-income states particularly hard in terms of the taxes of their constituents would have gone up considerably. But it's hard to look, ahead and predict exactly what to expect in the next round of changes that we may see in terms and predict who would be the winners or losers. But certainly certain tax expenditures that, like we talked about, the state and local tax deductibility.
That's one where we all lose under that.
Everyone loses there, and it's just it's a question of degrees. The mortgage interest deduction, if there's something done to cap that would certainly hit areas with high property value, especially if it's capped at a certain value of the home. So there are a lot of factors that could go into who
Great.
loses more, but we'll have to see.
Great. Well, we're going to take one final question, and it relates to DISH, which Matt mentioned a bit. But maybe you could elaborate a little bit more in terms of that broader discussion of the administration being sensitive about touching Medicaid because they're trying to get states to make certain decisions about expansion. Meanwhile, we have DISH cuts scheduled, just part of the Affordable Care Act. I think you did a great job of clarifying, for me anyway, what the DISH cuts in the tax compromise mean, and that they're really not a new issue. It's just kind of an accounting exercise. But we do have these scheduled DISH cuts, and they are apportioned by the Secretary of HHS. Do you have any predictions as to how the DISH cuts will play out in states? In that, on the one hand, states who might need them might need to have the least cuts, or the states who are perhaps least likely to expand.
Yeah, so it's a great question, and this is one of those unplanned types of policy challenges that you get when you have the Supreme Court coming in and making significant policy changes to established law. So the ACA was passed, and under that, every state was going to expand Medicaid, and so therefore every state was going to see a reduction in their uncompensated care funding. It made perfect sense. Post-Supreme Court, where the expansion itself is now an option, but all of the rest of the ACA is still mandatory, so including the DISH reductions. So you do set up this interesting dynamic where if a state chooses not to do the expansion, that state will see a reduction in its DISH payments anyway. And therefore, so this is sort of taking this conversation outside of the deficit reduction talks and sort of back into the ACA and Supreme Court discussions. You've got a really fascinating dynamic where, while the decision to do the expansion or not is one that's going to be made jointly by the governor and the state legislature, it is very, very clear that the state hospital associations in every one of the 50 states, the district, et cetera, are going to be going into overtime trying to convince the governor and the legislature to do the expansion because they know they're getting hit. And if they don't get that increase in coverage, if they don't get that revenue stream, that Medicaid revenue stream, they're in danger of going out of business or of massively having to restructure their business model. That dynamic is, I'll be honest, that dynamic is one that the administration is counting on.
Mm-hmm. Yes.
The administration, for a number of obvious and some less obvious reasons, wants every state to do the expansion, and is not terribly excited about trying to go into any sort of horse trading or negotiating or bargaining with any state to try to get them to do it, because it knows that, you know, you start in the negotiations with Texas, to pick a state, you're going to have 49 other states lining up behind them to say, hey, I want that deal, or hey, I want this other deal, or what have you. So the administration doesn't want, they just want there to be a clear yes or no decision, and they want the yes or no to be predisposed to yes. So the administration wants the state hospital associations to be scared, and aggressively lobbying for the state to do it. And I think that, you know, just my personal sense, my personal read of the situation is that the administration thinks, because it has come out and said no partial expansions, no waivers until 2017, they think that the pieces are in place, the political leverages, et cetera, the money, to force every state to wholeheartedly or reluctantly say yes to the expansion.
Exactly. So,
and they are going to continue to remain sort of above the fray and outside of this negotiations, so long as their read of that situation maintains. And that will be the big question: is what is the reality? What is, you know, the word on the street? Are we really going to have, you know, as the administration thinks, 50 states who they may complain up and down about this, but like the stimulus money, to a person, they all took it? Or are there really a core 5, 10, 15 states who, when you give them yes or no, all in, all out, they really say no?
And then the decision is, do they bargain at that point?
And do they when do they bargain? How much do they bargain?
And what are their chips?
And what are their chips?
Is it DISH? Is it provider tax determination?
Who knows?
Who knows?
Exactly. I think that's, I don't know. Nobody knows that at this point.
That's fascinating.
But that's the big. This is in many ways kind of a big game of chicken. Yeah. And we don't know who's going to blink.
And you can see why they don't want to have 50 separate negotiations.
Sure.
And
I wouldn't want to.
No. Well, this has been a great discussion, and actually, everybody on the line, I want to thank you because you stayed on the line throughout it all. I can, the group that signed on with us is largely still here, almost an hour later. So I want to just end it by saying, I'm really happy to have had Matt and Catherine here. That I've learned a lot in terms of just how states are dealing with their uncertainty, some of the kind of forward-thinking planning decisions that state budget officers have made, and I think it's another just indication that it's great to work for states because states do solve problems and think through these kind of issues that I wish the folks in the big white building across the street from the Hall of States here in Washington, D.C. would think through. And then from Matt's side, I have to say that the observations you shared with us on where Medicaid stands in a possible next round of grand compromise that will have to deal with entitlement spending are probably one of the more reassuring things I've heard since the new year in terms of federal funding for states. So this has been a very enlightening discussion. I want to encourage everyone on the line to, if you have other questions, just email me directly. I'll try to bother Catherine or Matt here in the building and get an answer for you. And also, there's some great resources that are going to be coming out soon. I know federal funds information for states is going to have an analysis. I think it's going to come out next week on just kind of looking at the new sequestration figures. So there's some new good products that are going to be coming out from other organizations. We at CSG have a small analysis on the state death tax issue, delightful as that may be, that will be coming out tomorrow, so look for that on our website. But thank you to everybody on the line, and I look forward to working with you all.